Hi everybody and welcome to the Art of Procurement. I'm your host, Philip Eidson, and I'm trying out a new introduction format today so we can get you straight into the conversation as quickly as possible. And my guest today is Nick Seiersen. Nick is a director with the International Association for Contract and Commercial Management, or IACCM for short. And I want to thank my friends at Procurement for actually connecting Nick and I. Nick will be speaking at the upcoming Procurement Indirect West Conference. It's in Scottsdale in Arizona, starting on September the 18th. So check out our show notes from the episode today for a little bit more information about that event. Well, in our chat, I wanted to explore a couple of different topics. Firstly, what are some of the contracting pitfalls that Nick sees buyers make time and time again that we really should be aware of? And then secondly, we talk innovation, both in terms of commercial models, but also contract design. And one example was a company using a fully illustrated contract used in lieu of a standard employment contract. Just one example there that Nick mentioned. But my first question to Nick was, how does a biochemist, and that was Nick's area of study at university, how does a biochemist actually become involved in contract innovation?
Quite by accident, I think,
Right.
is probably true. I grew up in Switzerland in the shadow of the UN and the big multinational European headquarters, and grew up with 50 different nationalities at school. So became sort of consciously or unconsciously multicultural. And I've lived in Belgium, in France, and in Canada, and done lots of consulting, and I think that's the consulting piece, is trying to understand at the dirty details how things work and how they interact. And I think that's what biochemists learn very early on in their careers. So I've spent a lot of time in consulting with Proudfoot, with A.T. Kearney, with KPMG. I even did the Bearing Point adventure.
Right.
I've even had real jobs, like at KGHM. I was responsible for $500 million of local and regional spend in Canada, in the US, and in Chile. So an interesting set of experiences.
Yeah. So you're working now, I think, with IACCM, and just for the benefit of listeners who might not be aware of IACCM, and I think for the context for the rest of the discussion, I just wonder if you could explain a little bit about what it is.
Well, the IACCM is my labor of love after all of this supply chain stuff and consulting stuff. It's a not-for-profit, global not-for-profit association. 43,000 members. We're growing around 13% a year in 164 countries. So truly a global footprint that is dedicated to finding the right deals with the right suppliers. And it just so happens that's the title of my book that I wrote in French. But we bring the buyers and the sellers and their legal advisors to try and find mutually beneficial agreements. And it's particularly effective in the complex service space.
So how are some of the ways then that you actually do that as an association, as a not-for-profit association?
So we do a number of things, but we believe that the road to more effective commercial management, more effective contract management, is through a balanced improvement of enterprise capability and individual competence. And in order to help develop that, we have assessment tools, and we have a skills assessment and a capability maturity assessment that highlights where organizations have to push in order to go to the next step. And then we have tools that help organizations move from one step to the next. And the most significant of those would be our certification programs, which are globally recognized certifications in contract management, commercial management, and supplier relationship management.
So a lot of learning and development.
A lot of learning and development, but also a lot of peer interaction. And you learn from your peers in the industry and out of the industry. We coined the phrase outsight as understanding what others are doing and bringing it into your industry.
Well, I'm really happy that we're able to chat today, because I think I'm something like episode 145 or 150. I'm not quite sure when it'll be when we go live with the episode, but I've not really done much talking about contracts themselves, and yet they're so fundamental. And so I think it's a great opportunity. There's a couple of different areas that I want to go into in our discussion today. I want to talk a little bit about some of the pitfalls, and then maybe where some of the innovations lay. What are the companies that are already kind of doing a good job in contracting? Where can they go next? On the pitfalls front, what are some of the pitfalls that you most often see in the way that companies actually approach the way that they write and the way they execute contracts?
We published a seminal piece of research around the 10 pitfalls of contracting. But if I were to sum them up, there are really the biggest pitfall is failure to agree on scope and objectives.
Right.
And there's a number of reasons why you do that. One of them is you don't engage the stakeholders, and therefore they don't have a say in the matter, so they can't possibly have aligned objectives. There are ineffective negotiation tactics, ineffective negotiation approaches, and then rigid contract terms, rigid contracting processes, rigid contracting impositions on the trading partner end up driving suboptimal outcomes. So those are sort of the generally the highest ones.
Yeah.
And the things we do around that is, first of all, we provide principles on the terms that are most bittered about, but which don't make an awful lot of impact on the final result. Things like intellectual property. So we've defined principles that are a happy medium between the buyer and the seller. And if you can adopt those principles, you don't have to negotiate on those for hours and hours and hours. And that time you have left over, you can do align on objectives and goals and make sure that everything falls into place so that you have a successful relationship and a successful delivery.
You mentioned IP. What are some of the other areas where you think that we end up spending far too much time on negotiating terms that aren't typically, and I use the word typically because obviously it's not the case all the time, but aren't typically most material to kind of what you're trying to achieve or strive for in a contract or protect yourself against?
Well, they are typically the ones that come up in litigation, and we tend to spend as much as 50% of the time negotiating terms that will prevail in court.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, our research shows that 0.07% of disputes actually end up in court.
Right.
So we're spending far too much time on things like liquidated damages, and that's wasting the time that we could be spending talking about what the goals are and objectives and aligning on them, talking about how we're going to manage the relationship, talking about how we're going to deal with the inevitable change, and how we're going to govern the final result, and making sure we both have strong incentives to succeed together.
Yeah, just aligned objectives.
And you have the right infrastructure in place to reach that work. Some of the other pitfalls are a poor handover to the people who actually have to take the supplier relationship and make it successful. It gets thrown over the wall. So bad handover and bad post-award management, because they may have been brought up in a context where the contractors were serfs. And with the complex kinds of contracts we're trying to do today, treating your supplier as a serf is just not going to be effective. So sometimes we have to educate the business to become more commercially aware of today's realities.
It's interesting that we spend all this time sometimes on contracting, and then, I've seen examples multiple times of the fact we do that, and then we don't actually, post-contract signing, we forget about it.
Yes, and there is more and more recognition that failures in this space are very much attributable to the buyer not fulfilling their obligations and not the supplier failing to perform.
Right.
And so it is absolutely critical that the buyer is organized to fulfill their own obligations and recognizes when they don't, and corrects when they're not fulfilling their obligations, because they are frequently just as responsible as the supplier in the failure to perform.
The other thing from my experience that I often see missed in a contract, and again, this isn't for every single contract, but it's failure to protect against the downside. I've seen contracts where And this is, again, where I'm thinking of the larger multi-year, multi-tower deals if it's in an outsourcing, again, really material to the business. And you kind of contract them with this utopian vision of everything's going to continue to grow. And you have lots of ways built into the contract that suggests, if volumes increase this way, if we add this additional scope, all these things, this is what it's going to do. And this is how we're going to benefit from that. But what we don't necessarily do, again, just my experience is put protections in on the downside. What happens if we actually get smaller as a company, if we end up not necessarily needing all the parts of this deal, what does that mean for us? And I wonder if that's something that you see often, or whether that's just some poor personal experiences that I've had around working with contracts.
No, I think that's a very much the sorts of things that we see. And I think it's partially a consequence of squabbling over those terms and conditions that will help you prevail in court, but are actually unimportant for the final outcome. And I believe that the risk management plan for a major procurement starts when you're preparing the scope and you're working out what role the vendor is going to play in the overall initiative and what the risks are and who's going to bear them and how you're going to deal with it.
Yeah.
And at that point, you should be thinking about, well, what happens if it doesn't work and how do we deal with it? And it might be off-ramps, it might be recalibrating the kinds of investments that are made. It might also mean revisiting the payment terms because the fixed investment are being amortized over less volume if you're on the downside, and similarly if you're on the upside, then the converse applies.
How important is trust when it comes to contracting?
That means we must trust the company that we're buying from. And trust is built on a proven identity that demonstrates that you are who you appear to be, and reputation that leads us to believe that you will do what we expect. So trust has never become more important in this environment. I'll give you a couple of examples of kind of hackneyed new commercial models. When the auto OEM says it'll pay you for the tires on the car that they're assembling when they roll off the line, the supplier trusts that the OEM will actually pay them and will still be solvent. And the OEM trusts that the right tires will be on the line when the car slides up to be equipped. So how you manage that relationship is very different from the traditional arm's length. I'll bid you down and cram a service level down your throat, and if you don't make it, I'll punish you. It's a totally different type of relationship. So when GE or one of the big aircraft engineers say, I'll pay you, you pay me for engine thrust, and I will make engine thrust available to you when you need it, it means you're going to be playing at a different field as well. You're going to trust that the engine records are going to be complete and there's no hiding use of the engines. The airline will trust that the engines are going to work. And there's a joint planning that focuses on when you have to have uptime and when you can do maintenance. So it's a joint planning relationship where you really both are in the ultimate success together, and not the supplier is there to abide by your rules and your whims. So I think trust in these relationships is extremely important, and it can be very quickly lost.
You mentioned something there about with the buying thrust, from an aircraft engine, for example. So as we're switching to buying outcomes versus a product or versus a service, how does that change how we need to think about the contract? The
contract has to reflect a fair and equitable relationship, and it has to be easy to understand. The days where you had a pile of gobbledygook that nobody could understand represents massive risk.
Yeah.
Because if the contracting party doesn't understand their obligations and their rights, they will not be an effective trading partner. So equitable, easy to understand, and some of the things that we're seeing in our natural language processing that allows us to generate a custom contract that is adapted to the specific relationship and uses standards where you can not necessarily define the standard term that you ram down the trading partner's throat,
Right.
but you understand the principle and the allowable latitudes that you will accept. And some of the systems today are actually allowing you to define that. And these are within your standards, but your standards are not rigid words on a page. They are parameters within which you're comfortable living. And they can actually absorb third-party paper, analyze those terms, and define the areas where they're outside of your parameters, which is where you focus your negotiation.
Right. We chatted a little bit before the interview about different commercial models. You mentioned them a few moments ago about them becoming a little bit more innovative. I think the outcome-based approach was one of them. But I'm just interested if you could share what some of the other models, like commercial models, may look like to start thinking about how we engage with suppliers and then how we contract with them, and how that may change from, I think what the standard is of just having a set of T's and C's, an SOW and MSA off the shelf, and trying to shoehorn everything into that one format.
So depending on your category strategy, and therefore the relationship you're trying to have and the relationship that you can reasonably have, and the objectives you want out of this relationship, then you can start thinking, how do I want to contract with the third party? And we've seen essentially three emerging models with different emphases. One is Agile contracting, which is very good in a highly uncertain environment, such as information technology development, which is using innovation. And the innovation may or may not pay off, in which case you may have to backtrack. So you do bite-sized engagements, and you are able to turn on a dime and pivot in a different direction depending on how the project plays out. You can have performance-based contracts where it's very clear that the company you're contracting with knows exactly how to do this, and you don't, and that's why you're partnering with them. And they will happily take a bonus for exceptional performance as long as that has value for you. And then one we've seen a lot of interest in is the relational contracting model, where we change the type of interaction, and we're truly working in this together. And what we found is we can actually take in-flight relationships and help move them towards a relational model. And that starts to resolve some of the conflicts that have evolved over time. And we find that the outcomes start changing very quickly. So it's a very effective way of taking a neutral or adversarial relationship and helping learn to work together. And then if you take the model that is sort of out on the extreme right, if you will, the vested outsourcing model, it's one step beyond relational, I would say, and highly structured way of a very strong alignment of objectives. So there's a continuum from the traditional reverse auction to the vested and relational types of relationships.
The agile contract that you talked about, that's for me a little bit harder to visualize what that could look like. I wonder if you could just share, some of the tenets of an agile contract. How does it differ?
All sorts of elements that come to play, but at its very simplest is defining the types of interactions you have with the business and working out how to be extremely responsive for the simpler ones so that you free up time to concentrate on the more complex ones. And at that point, trying to work through the process so that you can be effective and responsive at the same time, and that you have a checkpoint that says, okay, I've gone as far as I can in isolation. We now have to take a different tack, reach out to the supply base, reach out to the business to get confirmation, reach out to finance to make sure that we're not outside of the budget, reach out to legal to make sure we're not trying to take on things that they would never accept. So it's also chunking the process down to things that can be done effectively, autonomously, and quickly.
Yeah.
And then working out what the logical chain is and what are the interactions that go between them. And when you take that to a project, it's at what point do you know that the project has done what it should do, or the sub-project has done what it should be? So if you're testing RFID in a dangerous environment where there's a lot of metal or liquid, you're going to see if the technology can be adapted to be used effectively. So you'd have a small mini project to test the concept. And if the concept works, then you'd test scaling it up. And each one of those would be bite-sized chunks, because what you'll learn at the end of each one of those bite-sized chunks is either we have to think about what we want to do as an alternative, or we've had confirmation that this risk is no longer a risk that we have to worry about, and we can move to the next risk that has to be tested and tried.
I imagine these are really, you want to use these where you've got a high trust environment, so that no one party is going to look to use this as a way as well of taking advantage of the other party in a commercial way.
That's exactly it. It's understanding very early on in the process who you want to work with, and understanding that you have compatible cultures and compatible objectives, and that one party will not seek to take advantage of the other when the chips are down. And the chips are going to be down sooner or later.
I know. That's what, and that's always the risk that we try and protect ourselves against. And while we often then, I think, revert back to standard terms and conditions where we think we're protecting ourselves against all these different risks, even if we might not be. When you think about those different models, how do you decide when to use which model? And perhaps when to just go and use your traditional standard MSA, SOW?
I think it's driven by your category strategy, by the relationship that you can and wish to have, and by the objectives you want from this particular relationship. But the standard framework is now able to change to a certain degree with these new tools, where you can set parameters or guardrails around the risks you're willing to take in various clauses, rather than sticking to the letter of the law, as it were. So the contracts can become somewhat more flexible, while nevertheless existing within a standard set of parameters that you're comfortable with. So that creates additional flexibility.
So we talked a little bit about innovation in commercial models, but how about innovations in the contract itself? And I've never really considered innovations in the contract over and above those different models that you talked about, but I know that this is something that you've been seeing just from our conversations again before we hit the record button. So how can we actually innovate the way in which a contract is written?
So there's a number of things that can be done. I think, first of all, the actual contract design represents a huge amount of possibility if you go back to the traditional legalese, standard terms, standard contract, standard format, and essentially written for lawyers, by lawyers, to prevail in court. That is not an effective governance instrument for a relationship that has complex outcomes and collaboration. So there is opportunity to design the contract in a more fit-for-purpose manner. Part of it is to highlight obligations and rights of both parties. And when we've mapped this out for some of our corporate members, they then see that they've foisted all of the obligations onto the supplier and retained very few obligations of their own. And yet they see themselves as very equitable trading partners. So those realizations help understand, do we have a balanced design? And are we also communicating clearly things like flow charts and swim lanes, things like timelines illustrated, things like pictograms that show which particular pieces of the score? So bringing visual illustrations into the contract. But we're even seeing situations where the contracts themselves are being redesigned completely. And one of the examples that we've given an award for innovation recently was taking the contracts and putting them into simple enough language that they would help the local communities adopt modern contracting principles in their dealings with mines, utilities, oil and gas exploration companies that are coming out into Aboriginal environments, and they want them to start working for them, but they want to do it in a somewhat controlled. So how do they simplify their contractual documents and their commercial processes to make it effective in driving local economic development?
Interesting.
And we have this wonderful example of another award was the comic contract.
Right.
And it's a 16-page comic that explains to the fruit picker what his rights and obligations are, when he has to turn up for work, how quickly he has to warn if he's sick and can't come to work, how many hours he's expected to work, when he gets vacation, actually spills out all of the elements of the employment contract in a comic book.
Right.
So you don't have to be able to read and write. You just have to be able to consume a comic book to understand the employment conditions. So we have, our members have these examples. They love sharing them.
You know, when you talk about that, that's fascinating, like a comic type of contract, so all visual. You know, how would something like that stand up in court? You know, just if I think backwards, and I know you said right at the very beginning, so perhaps there's a moot point that we're again trying to solve for the wrong thing, and trying to solve something that does stand up in court. But when contracts are so much down to interpretation, when you start arguing about the weeds and when you get into disagreements, I would imagine something like that is really, it opens itself up to a lot of interpretation. I'm just interested in the reality of, you know, how binding something like that would actually be.
I mean, the thing about international law is it's as binding as you let it be. And so if you use a fancy lawyer to understand the tiny little loophole that was not addressed, that says an awful lot about how you trade, and that reputation will follow you wherever you go.
Yeah.
So most organizations, when they get into that kind of situation and they find that there's a legitimate misunderstanding, either it's bad faith, in which case you have to work out how you're going to treat that, or there is truly scope for a misunderstanding. And if there's truly scope for a misunderstanding, then the party responsible for creating the misunderstanding and taking advantage of it, and they may not necessarily be the one, they have to work out how they're going to handle that, because how they handle that will define how they are perceived, and that'll define who's vying for their business. Mm-hmm. And they'll end up getting the trading partners that they deserve.
Yeah. So I think my last question, because I know it's time for us to start wrapping up today, we've talked about different ways that we can contract, you know, some of the innovations in business models. As procurement, you know, the majority of listeners obviously come from a procurement perspective. How can we help influence colleagues within legal to think more creatively about contracting? You know, using some of the innovations or some of the different business models and commercial approaches that we talked about, because my assumption is, and this could be a flawed one, but again, based on my own experience, ultimately our legal teams are the ones that are really setting the standard for the organization. So if they want something protected in a certain way, if they want to have this 50-page dense legalese contract, that's ultimately what we'll be forced into implementing.
You may, but not necessarily.
Okay.
But the point you raise is extremely relevant, and we hear it again and again from our members. And it's so important that our Toronto conference, we are going to have the inaugural panel to kick off the conference is going to be one-sided terms. Do they pay? And there's a lawyer in Chicago who's done some research on this, Ross Altman. He's going to kick off the conference. So I think the discussion to have with the lawyers is, you know, understand that you'll recognize that they have a role to play, mm-hmm. but also understand that when they go too far, what is the perverse effect of that? And look at who's bidding on your business. And I was going to say, a transaction is okay if you're in a low risk environment.
Yeah.
And there are plenty of those because we're still buying 40% of what we're buying are products that we're buying, taking full control of, and taking it to end of life. But that was 80% 20 years ago. Now we're buying more and more complex services.
Yeah.
And in a complex, highly innovative environment, high risk, high complexity, or transformative, if you set the wrong tone, you're not likely to get alignment of objectives, so you're not likely to be successful. Mm-hmm. So and if you, I've seen a number of public sector organizations that have very one-sided terms that they won't negotiate. And you look at who bids and what they bid. You see a number of organizations that will not take those terms and don't bother bidding.
Yeah.
You see a number of organizations that bid obsolete products.
Yeah.
Which is fine if you're, or old products, which is fine if you're doing a transaction. But if you're trying to do something highly innovative, that's not going to make it. And then you see some organizations that create shell companies that inherit all of the capabilities of the mother company but have a very, very weak balance sheet. Mm-hmm. So all of those protections that you've negotiated are effective, useless, because you're dealing with a non-viable
right, they don't have the ability to follow through on any of the punishments that you may have put in that contract in the first place.
Right. So having that discussion of the consequences of, and it takes time. I remember having that discussion with one of my clients, and it took several months to get the legal counsel to come around and loosen up their parapublic stance. But when they did, they started getting a lot of better vendors and more robust organizations coming to the contract. So that's, I think, how you handle it. But I think also looking into Ross Altman's research will also provide some additional insight that you can work. And this is a lawyer talking to lawyers, so you have instant credibility there.
Well, Nick, thank you very much for sharing your insights, your experiences around contracts, both from a pitfalls perspective. I know that some of these, they may seem obvious at first glance, but then there's, I think there's always things to learn from it. Even if you think that you're doing the right thing, go and, take a look and reflect on, are you really doing everything that you can from a basics perspective to make sure you've got effective contracts? And then from an innovation perspective, just different ways of thinking about things. If listeners would like to connect with you, learn a little bit more about some of the areas you've touched on, where can they find you?
So I will be at ProcureCom Indirect West in Phoenix in September 18th to 20th. I'm talking about contract innovation.
Okay.
And the IACCM is at the IACCM.com.
Yeah.
Sign up to be a guest member and you'll get access to some of the resources. And bear in mind the IACCM conference in Toronto on October 11th to 13th, where you'll see Ross Altman. And to get hold of me in particular, you can go check out my website, which is going to be www.seierseninc.com.
Yep.
And my book in French called The Right Deal with the Right Supplier is on Amazon.
Okay.
Or Le Bon Accord avec le Bon Fournisseur, for those of you who speak French, because those are going to be the only ones who want to have a look at it.
Well, a few links there, but what I'll do is I'll make it easy, as I usually do. I'll put all those in the show notes so that any listener who wants to reach out, get in touch, check out the book and also ProcureCon. Those will all be at artofprocurement.com/contract innovation. That's artofprocurement.com/contract innovation. Nick, one last time, thank you very much for joining me. Thank you for listening to another episode of The Art of Procurement. To find an archive of all past episodes, you can go to artofprocurement.com/episodes. And to ensure you never miss another show, go to artofprocurement.com/subscribe.